whatever I'm going to say today should be, labeled as explorations. These are what I would call notes to an investigation. These are questions I'm raising based on years of thinking about these issues and the changes that we have seen. It's also based on the research and writing that I've been doing for the past 3-4 years and what I'm writing in terms of a book. And now I'll start off through an anecdote. And this is basically from my childhood, from the school that I went to. And I went to a school in Delhi. I was born here and I was brought up here. And I went to a private school, which was reasonably progressive school for that time. And it was called Sardar Patel Vidyalaya. And at that time, there was the right as we know it. The Hindutva right was not that prominent. We knew that there was something called RSS. And in fact, the residential area, I used to see these neighbors going in the morning with their cap and their shorts on a walk. And I really didn't associate it with anything. If anything, it was the Congress party was dominant in Delhi at that time. And if you saw a youth Congress person, you would generally be scared of them. So that is how it was. What I want to focus on more is how at that time, at least in Delhi, and I can only speak about Delhi and because that is the place I grew up in, at least in Delhi, schools promoted certain kind of ideologies. And what I mean by that is that we were taught to be secular. We were taught to a certain degree to take religion with a pinch of salt. So what that did was, at least in the public arena, in the space which was defined by the school or the space where friends met, talking about religion or talking about religious rituals was met with a degree of disdain, with a degree of derision, if one can say that. And there was one boy who used to come to school with a tilak on his head. Now, I don't know what the equivalent would be in Malayalam, but tilak is like a mark, a red mark that you see that often is worn by Hindus. And that particular boy, in the morning, his mother obviously did some kind of puja or worship prayers in the morning in front of God and would put a tilak on his head and he would come to school. And often you would see that he's taken it off. And there would be a remnant of that tilak there, that red mark that you would see there. And people would make fun of him. All the children would make fun of him. He would be bullied for that. They would call him superstitious. There was in a lot of ways, religious ritual was identified with superstition. And that is the mainstream. And I will have to admit that I belong to a school where most of the people would belong to what is today called Lutyens elite or the Lutyens gang, right? People whose parents were bureaucrats or were teachers, lawyers, well-placed people with social capital. And I belong to that school. My father was a trade unionist. He was the president of the Delhi University Teachers Association, and also he was the joint secretary of the All India Teachers, Federation of Teachers, University Teachers. And he kind of started teachers' unions in Delhi University, and then even participated in teachers' unions across India, including Haryana. So I was trained in a slightly left-oriented way, but most of my friends were in that secular liberal space. They were not right-wing. Now, for me, actually, right-wing as a child meant Congress Party. To us, Congress Party was anti-communist. And I grew up in a Communist Party household. My father was the first member of the CPIM in Delhi. And a lot of my relatives were associated with the left movement. And therefore, I was trained in a slightly different way. But as I'm saying that, even those who were not left, those who did not come from left-oriented homes, they were essentially left of center. They believed in liberal values. They believed in what would today be called human rights. They believed that Muslims are as Indian, Muslims and Christians are as Indian as Hindus are. They believed in the rights of women. They believed in the rights of poor people. There was a sense that even the rich and the elite have to work for the poor. So I'm saying that that was the identity even in the early 80s. The middle class's identity was informed by a sense of nation building, that we have to build the nation, and nation building involves helping the poor, working for the poor, uplifting the poor. Science, bringing science into the space, keeping religion out, questioning what we know about history itself. Because if you look at it, when the Congress was in power, the Indian Council for Historical Research, ICHR, was often headed by left wingers. I mean, Irfan Habib, who's a well-known Marxist historian, headed the ICHR at one point, and he was appointed, if I'm not mistaken, during Rajiv Gandhi's period. Most of these were left-oriented people. History that was being NCRT textbooks were being written by leftists, and that was the broad idea that we had. But what happened that suddenly in the 90s, all of it changed. Suddenly in 1991, as if there was this threshold, this watershed period when everything changed, and we see that the middle class suddenly says, socialism is bad. I want to go back to my roots. I must look at my own religious beliefs. What happened? What caused that? And I think that this actually has a very long history, and it has always been there in India's elite, except that that particular strand of the elite was not in power. Now, I'm going to make another, as I'm saying, a lot of these are they're investigations. They're not final statements in any way. I'm just bringing forward what are the investigations that I have done. They might change over a period of time. One of the things that we have been trained to believe is that in India, the caste differentiation is essentially between upper castes and OBCs and Dalits, right? We believe that upper castes are a single block who ruled, who are the elite, and then there is the OBCs and there are the Dalits. Now, while that is broadly correct when it comes to the idea of rulers versus those who are being ruled. Again, as I'm saying, it's broadly correct. I'm just trying to take out a quote while I speak so that I can read from that. But as I'm saying, that one of the things that we were trained to believe was that there is the upper caste, the Brahmin, Kayast, and I'm talking obviously about northern India, which kind of determines so-called what the nation is, right? Of course, in Kerala, the experience would be different. The Nayars are different, not exactly similar to what we've seen. The church is different in its orientation compared to the larger population. So Kerala has a different history. But if I had to speak about the history of North India, and therefore I'm being very specifically talking about North India because that is the arena. We often make the mistake of saying as if whatever we're talking about India is universal all over the place. But the reason why the history of North India becomes important in our case, especially the political history, because today it is the majority rule is coming from the north, the Hindi-speaking, the broadly Hindi-speaking belt that we talk about, which extends from Maharashtra all the way up to to Bihar, right? By Hindi-speaking, various dialects and Gujarati, Marathi, which identify broadly within the Hindi space. Now, what we see is that through the national movement, there has been a division within the upper castes. If you look at the Brahmin Kayasths, especially the English-educated, the Brahmin and Kayasths, they were people who both led and occupied the space of the national movement, except, of course, Gandhi, who himself was a Banya. But if you look at Brahmin castes controlled a large part of the national movement. They obviously manned because there were no women there, manned the Indian part of the bureaucracy, right? And there is a very telling passage from, I think, Discovery of India, from Nehru, where he actually calls capitalism the Baniya system. He actually terms it the Baniya system. This is interesting. He's talking about Western capitalism, but he calls it the Baniya system. Now, the reason I'm saying this is that here we have a Kashmiri Brahmin, and he is very clearly um, identifying capitalism with one strand of the upper caste, right? If you look at the history of trading and mercantile castes in India, then we will see that mercantile castes have, from the early 20th century and even late 19th century onwards, have been promoting the Hindutva groups. Now, Hindutva, obviously, political Hindutva, it emerges mostly in the 80s and onwards. But the Hindu communal political part, nationalism, which was Hindu communal, was broadly funded by the Marwadis, Baniyas, who became its core. But except that it's interesting that the RSS should be manned by the one particular kind of Brahmins. But the foot soldiers, the people who gave money, the people who promoted it, like the Gita Press, which was a very important press for religious texts and quasi-religious texts to come out in the pre-independence period and continued for a long time. They were all owned, funded by Marwadis. And that is an interesting thing that we see, that the Marwadis right from the beginning and the Baniyas right from the beginning, and I think in the south, if you look at the Chettiars and certain other mercantile communities, they had a very unique relationship with the national movement, because they were making money. They were industrialists, traders, and they had to collaborate with the British. But at the same time, they were funding the Congress, but they were critical of the Congress. If one looks at someone like G.D. Birla, for instance, very close to Gandhi and very critical of Nehru, didn't like Nehru at all. Nehru himself didn't like G.D. Birla. But G.D. Birla often said that, Muslims are actually not really Indian, right? He didn't say it directly, but what he said was very close to that Hindus are, there's nothing wrong with Hindu religion being the religion of India, right? Yes, Muslims have the right to live here. So he was always borderline, flirting with the idea that Hinduism or the Hindu community is equal and coterminous with India. And Nehru often had problems with it. And I'll give you one example. When Nehru wanted a bicycle, and this was before independence, and Gandhi told him to write to G.D. Birla, right? So that Birla could get him a bicycle. So Nehru writes to him, and Birla immediately sends 2 bicycles. And Birla actually gets, I think, a letter from Nehru, where Nehru is kind of testy. He's not happy that he had to do this, that he had to kind of ask for a favor from Birla. If you look at Gandhi, on the other hand, Gandhi actually had no problem living in Birla House. He died in Birla House. And in fact, when Nehru wanted Birla House to be nationalized, G.D. Birla was very unhappy, right? And Nehru said that, look, we want this to be nationalized because this is the place where Gandhiji died, not for any other reason. And there was a big move in the Congress to oppose Nehru to even nationalize that. So right from the beginning, we see a dislike for Nehru. And we see that even in the mid-30s, when Nehru takes over as president and flirts with Marxism and communism and socialism and attacks capitalists and says that Marxism is the way forward, the Russian path is the way forward. He actually says that in a speech in the Congress as Congress president. And that immediately makes people very worried. So we have an entire lot of the Bombay industrialists who put forward people who criticize Nehru. And there's a manifesto which comes out called the Bombay Manifesto, which essentially is against Nehru. And they say we need to get together to get rid of this person who's now going to lead the Congress party. If he comes, there's no hope for private property. There's no hope. Now, obviously, we know that Nehru was actually just a kind of a, middle of the road liberal. Once he managed to get support from the Congress Socialist Party, which was the left wing within the party. He quickly gave up all his flirtation with communism and Marxism and very quickly said, no, it doesn't work, right? But at heart, he was a very strong liberal. He was not very fond of religion. That was very clear. He was extremely pro-science. He was pro-modernity. He was against anything which was seen to be tradition. So Nehru, in a lot of ways, was opposed to what would be called tradition today, right? And that is one of the reasons why the right wing hates Nehru so much. They identify everything wrong in India with him. And all of Nehru's personal life is being brought forward with fake news and all. Why? Because he's being shown as this debauched and this kind of corrupt, morally corrupt person who became the prime minister, whereas Patel should have been. Should Patel have been the prime minister of India? That's an interesting question to ask, because Patel, again, was clearly a right-wing person, right, with great sympathies for the Hindutva movement, with several statements that you can find of him which are very clearly anti-Muslim. Whatever historians might try to whitewash today, Patel was was clearly not happy that Muslims were being given compensation, that Pakistan was given compensation. At one point, he said that, well, the Muslims have to show that they are loyal to this country. I'm paraphrasing all these. They might not be exactly the way this is, but it was known that Patel had these issues. And both Rajendra Prasad, who was seen as Patel's man, and Rajendra Prasad really disliked the Nehruvian mode of the Congress and played a big role in reviving the Somnath temple. Nehru was opposed to the president going and giving a speech there. And there were times when Rajendra Prasad wrote things against Nehru for being anti-Hindu or even being anti-tradition and being too leftist. Patel actually told Rajendra Prasad that, keep quiet, you have to be the president. Don't go against Nehru right now. Interestingly, after Nehru becomes prime minister, who are the people who become the cabinet members, right? Especially after the second interim government is over, and when most of the others who were part of the interim government, like Ambedkar or even Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, resign and move on, and a Congress government is formed. You'd be surprised to see how many of the people who were part of this government were actually people who collaborated with the British. They were not part of the national movement. They were not part of the Congress at all. Many of the names that you find there were people who were anti-Congress, those who were anti the national movement. Almost all of the bureaucracy, whether it is Nehru didn't have a secretary in the PMO, but the joint secretaries, whether it was the joint secretary in charge of the cabinet, they were all ICS officers who had been very pro-British, most of them. In fact, there is a interesting anecdote when Sri Prakash, I think he became the governor of, I think either UP or something. He was one of the Congress leaders before independence, and Sri Prakash was jailed. And one ICS officer actually wrote that when independence took place, Sri Prakash took his hand and took him over to Nehru and said that Jawaharlal, meet my jailer. He was the warden in the jail He's a great guy. He will really be very good as an administrator. And Nehru says, yeah, please. Yes, of course. So the people that the new government had to deal with were actually people who imprisoned them, people who collaborated with the British. These were the people who were going to become bureaucrats. I'm not saying that but their tendency was always going to be state-oriented. They said that we serve our masters. Today, our masters are the Congress, Indian National Congress. Before that, they were the British. So this is the interesting dichotomy that we see right at the time that the state is born. And some of you would know that Acharya Kriplani, who was the Congress president, actually resigned, because he said that all the values of the Congress have been given up by this government. The objective of the national movement was that we are going to establish a government which is government of the people. And the Congress represents the people's will. And therefore, the Congress party and the party organization should have a say on how policies are framed. And Nehru and Patel and others had no truck with that. They did not want that to happen at all. They wanted the government to be independent. And once independence has happened, the government becomes an independent entity altogether, and the party has no role. And Kripalani lost the battle, and he resigned, and he said that I don't want to be part of it. So and then we see a person who's willing to listen to the government. So there was a division within the Congress party between those who were government type people who believe the government must be powerful, and those who believe that the party must tell what the government should do, and the prime minister has to listen to the party. Now, here is an interesting thing that we see. When the prime minister was to be, it was to be decided who will be Congress president and who will, and therefore will become the first prime minister, I think out of the 15 Congress Pradesh committees, 13 voted for Patel and 2 did not vote at all. It might be 11-4, the exact number doesn't matter, but no one wanted Nehru. Majority wanted Patel. Gandhi convinced Patel to let Nehru be prime minister. And people say, okay, and the right wing today will say that Nehru stole the prime ministership, it should have been Patel. But the truth of the matter is, Patel might have been extremely good in managing the party organization, and therefore the various Congress Pradesh committees, which were essentially the landed elite, the trading classes, the various professionals who had occupied spaces in these Pradesh committees, supported Patel. But Patel himself could never have won an election. In fact, at one of these Congress committees, a volunteer didn't even recognize Patel. He stopped him at the gate and said, "Who are you? Why are you coming in?" He had to say that, "I am Sardar Patel," and then he was let in. Nehru knew and Gandhi knew that Nehru was the popular candidate. He was the person who would win elections. And therefore, Nehru, right from the beginning, wanted to defeat the right wing, which was dominant. We might not think of this today, but the right wing was dominant in the Congress party. And Nehru, in a sense, actually stole India from the Congress party. And why am I saying that? In 1950, the Congress has an election. And Nehru puts up his own candidate. By now, he has kind of had a rapprochement with Acharya Kripalani, and he says, okay, this man is left of center, he's a socialist and my kind of person, he should stand for election. And Patel and most of the Congress put up Purushottam Das Tandon. Purushottam Das Tandon is the equivalent of today's Yogi Adityanath. His main agenda at that time, political agenda, he believed, was cow protection. He was extremely pro-Hindu, that Hindu laws should be dominant and the Hindus should be majority rule was his thing. And he believed Muslims should exist happily, but with restricted. And these are things that he might not have made public, but a lot of times he did make it public. He was known as an extreme conservative Hindu communal person. So here is the election that takes place, and Nehru realizes that if this election takes place, then there is a problem, because the Hindutva lobby, and today I'm calling it Hindutva, obviously at that time it wasn't called Hindutva, it was called the communal lobby of that time, will take over the party, because that was dominant. And Nehru loses the election. Nehru's candidate actually loses the election, and Purushottam Das Tandon becomes the president of the Congress party. In some ways, fortunately for Nehru, Patel dies, and clearly one powerful person in the Congress party is not there anymore. Although, of course, Patel and Nehru had a complex relationship, but they were also both together, but sometimes they would oppose each other on various issues. And Patel dies. He was very unwell. He dies. And Nehru manages to make Purushottam Das Tandon resign, because he says that I cannot work with this Congress president, right? He represents a completely different thing from what I do. And he becomes all powerful in a sense, and probably the first supreme leader in that sense, right? Despite that, there are attempts to pull him down and do things like that. And Nehru is therefore desperate to have an election, because he knows that an election is the one which he will win. He cannot win the Congress within the Congress party, because the elite of that time is actually right-wing. The Nehruvian socialism that we think of, and I'm calling it socialism in inverted commas, or the Nehruvian ideologies, right, of secularism, liberal values. They were in the minority. It was imposed in a lot of ways. And we see what happens is that even Patels, whether one takes Patel's secretary, whether one takes I think it was K. Munshi, the man who went all over to look at various kinds of constitutions and help put it together. Or, all of these people were extremely communal by today's. It's a complex thing, but I would say that if one had to judge them, they would tilt towards the side of Hindu communalism. And it is Nehru manages to defeat them. He knows that the people of India, as of now, will vote for him and support him. And that is exactly why Rajendra Prasad and various others say the time is not ripe for an election. Indians are not ready for elections, right? Nehru realizes that the only way he can control the state and control the government is to have elections, to get the mandate from people. And therefore, he forces an election on the Congress party, which is very reluctant to take place because it knows. And as soon as that happens, Nehru is able to establish his control. And even those who were, one would say, not communal, but extremely anti-left, like C. Rajagopalachari, for instance, extremely anti. I would think that in a lot of ways, he was a libertarian. He was anti-communist, extremely. And Rajagopalachari realizes that his days are numbered. He leaves and starts his own party, right? And Nehru manages to bring in the left-oriented people. Now, the interesting thing is that with that, we see the rise of an elite, which becomes essentially what would today be called a Lutyens elite, which is overwhelmingly Brahmin caste. If you do a caste analysis of this elite, overwhelmingly it will be Brahmin caste. But they come from a Western educated, pro-Soviet kind of background. We remember Soviet Union. I mean, many of the people listening here probably have no idea about the Soviet Union. I don't know. But Soviet Union was a very powerful entity at that time. And across the world, people who had come out of an experience of colonialism looked to the Soviet Union as the progressive entity, which would support them against imperialism. Today, the West might be less openly imperialist, less openly racist. But at that time, they'd just come out of colonialism. They still believed that India and all were, these are backward places. Still, they ought to have ruled here, right? So the elite was very Soviet looking. It looked towards the Soviet. Across the world, we had Nasser, we had Ataturk, all those who stood up against colonialism in various different ways. And Nehru was one of those figures. India was one of those spaces. India's elite was oriented like that. But as I'm saying, that right from the beginning, the mercantile communities were sidelined. And this, I think, increased even more after Indira Gandhi takes over. And we know that when Indira Gandhi actually takes over, I think there's a lot of wrong information given out about dynasties, right? The truth of the matter is that Indira Gandhi was very popular even before she became prime minister. And therefore, when Lal Bahadur Shastri became prime minister and he was declared as Nehru's heir by Nehru himself, I think in the last Congress that he attended, probably the Tripuri Congress, which was held in 1964 or something like that, Nehru, before dying, he was already very ill. And he kind of made Shastri's heir. Shastri actually went to meet Indira Gandhi and said that if you want to be prime minister, you should be prime minister. And Indira Gandhi says, I have no interest in being prime minister. Why did Shastri go? Because he even then knew that Indira Gandhi had the Nehru stamp and would be a very popular leader on the ground. Morarji Desai wants to be prime minister when an extreme right-winger, hardcore anti-communist wants to be prime minister, extremely anti-Soviet, pro-American, Delhi kind of lobbying with the Swaraj and the RSS and stuff like that to gain power. And Indira Gandhi manages to defeat them by aligning with the left. Again, Indira Gandhi had no real ideological orientation. She realized that the only way to defeat the syndicate, which was Rajagopalachari, Morarji Desai, and not Rajagopalachari at that time, but Morarji Desai. I might be getting the names slightly wrong, but definitely there was Kamraj, who could not become prime minister because he couldn't speak either Hindi or English. As he himself said, no Hindi, no English. How? When someone told him, why can't you become prime minister? He realized that even then, only the Hindi belt could provide prime ministers at that time. It was still far cry from H.D. Devi Gowda, right? Because ultimately, even Narasimha Rao actually knew 13 languages and could speak Hindi very fluently. So they are at that point trying to prop up someone who they think they can control, the syndicate can control, right? Nehru's dead, various local satraps want to control, want revision in whatever socialism Nehru had brought in, they want that to change, right? They want land reforms to be reversed. They want the mercantile and capitalist class to be given more space. Reforms to be brought in, as we know today, to the planning system. Indira Gandhi realizes that she is being controlled, so she rebels. And she realizes the way to rebel is to tie up with the CPI. Remember that, just look at the CPI. It was a very, very strong party, the CPI and the CPIM and alliance, and sometimes not in alliance, and after 75, not in alliance. In the first election, I think in India, CPI was the second largest party. It was the largest opposition party. So the Communist Party was one of the strongest parties at that time. So she aligns with them, realizes this is the best way to get rid of the right wing within the Congress, and moves the Congress towards the left, right? As much as she can. Moves it to the left, and we all know about nationalization of banks, of coal mines. We know what she did with various other things. And therefore, the rhetoric of Garibi Hatao makes her win the elections. Massive victory. She positions herself even better as a popular leader after the Bangladesh war. But by 1975, she's in trouble, and we know she brings in emergency, which was at that time backed by the CPI. And even in 1977, most people tend to think that Indira Gandhi was thrown out in 1977. She swept the southern states. She completely swept, I think, other than, or maybe CPI won Kerala, I might be wrong at that time. Basically, the Congress won everything in the south. So there was a clear division at that time between the southern states probably saw the Janta experiment as a Hindustan experiment, which the North didn't see it as, right? They saw it as a danger to secularism, danger to federalism, which the North didn't see it as. The North saw it as an attack on emergency, an attack on authoritarianism. But that kind of establishes the various kinds of non-Congress parties in that space, right? Again, that experiment fails. And in 1980, when Indira Gandhi comes back, remember, this is after the oil shock, global oil shock. And across the world, we are seeing Thatcher in 79, Reagan in 80, and all kinds of socialist or democratic governments are being overthrown. We know that in Iran, already Mossadegh has been overthrown through a coup of sorts. And the West wants Reza Pahlavi as the Shah to be brought back, fail, and Khomeini emerges. So the world changes, and Indira Gandhi is trying to change along with that. And we know that in 1980, Indira Gandhi is no longer socialist. She doesn't need the left at all. She wants to make friends with capitalists, right, with India's capitalist class. But even then, the rhetoric of the elite is still deeply anti-capitalist. And that only changes after the Soviet Union loses the Afghan war and the Soviet Union collapses. But I'll come to that a little later. I don't know if any of you have watched this Hindi film called Coolie. This is a movie which came out in 1983, if I'm not mistaken. And the poster of Coolie, and this became famous because Amitabh Bachchan got injured. And the doctors actually declared that he's clinically dead. And fans lined up outside the hospital to give blood. And he came out of the hospital after many months. So this became a big hit. And the movie became a big hit. It also came out right during the Bombay mill strike, right? And that, therefore, it's an interesting thing. This is a Hindi film, mainstream Hindi film, I think made by Prakash Mehra or Manmohan Desai, one of these pot boiler Hindi Bollywood movie makers, commercial movie. What is the poster of Coolie? The poster of Coolie is Amitabh Bachchan holding a hammer and sickle. His poster is him holding a hammer and sickle, typically as a Communist Party flag, in a red coolie's dress, right? Holding it up. And if I'm not mistaken, he's a Muslim person in the movie. He's actually Muslim. And when he's shot in the end by the villain, he's actually reciting the Kalima and he is, and people are clapping. Hindu, and I watched it in a theater. I was very young and I used to go to my father's hometown of sorts. He came from Bangladesh, East Pakistan, but there was a place where they used to live, which is outside Calcutta. And I was there, and it used to be very hot in those days. And the only way to beat the heat was to go to a movie theater. Right? I was 10, 11 years old, and there was one which had AC, so we would go there. My uncle would take us. As children, we were banned from watching Bollywood. We were told that this is counterculture, you can't watch it. But my uncle would kind of take us there because it was cold. And we would sit there and we watched all these people, CPIM cadre, dancing in joy when Amitabh Bachchan picks up the sickle and hammer and holds it up. And they're going, Guru, 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 Guru. I still remember. They're so happy to see Amitabh Bachchan doing that, right? And the entire theater is clapping as a Muslim character, Amitabh Bachchan, is both a Muslim and anti-capitalist, destroying the the industry owners, the factory owners' home, right? What happens? There's another movie which came out in 1985 or 86. This was made by Shekhar Kapoor. It was called Mr. India. It became famous for the dialogue "Mogambo Khush Hua." There was Amrish Puri saying "Mogambo Khush Hua," and that was very famous. All children used to say that. In that, every shopkeeper, merchant, businessman was a villain. In Hindi movies of the 70s and 80s, businessmen were villains. They were bad people. As a child, I grew up thinking that a rich person is always bad. And not just me, all my friends thought that rich people were bad, right? And then we come to the 90s and suddenly we have Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, in which the hero is not only rich, but he doesn't even live in India. He lives in London. Right? His father owns a corner shop in London. A few years later, there is one more movie, Kajol, Rani Mukherjee and Shah Rukh Khan. In that, everyone's rich. And after that, Hindi movie heroes are always rich. They're always business owners. Their parents are business owners, right? They're always rich. They're not poor anymore. The class distinction, the class was that Hindi cinema, commercial Hindi cinema promoted throughout the 70s and 80s, disappeared by the 90s. By the 90s, we have the Raj Malhotra, and these are the characters who become the heroes, and they're always in suits. There are these big weddings taking place, rich people. This is the handover of the elite now makes certain is the Brahmin caste state-oriented elite, which controlled the state, controlled the government, and believed that the role of the state is to uplift the poor. And they did nothing. The poor remained poor. Yes, maybe now it's even worse. And they controlled the economy. They had a lot of power. And it was, in a sense, a back-scratching society. Pupul Jayakar, who was Indira Gandhi's friend, became a person who decided what culture was going to be. Indira Gandhi liked Ramesh Thapar and took a fancy to Ramesh Thapar and his wife, and they became people who could dictate terms to the rest of India. Now, it might be great for us because these were left-oriented people, right? But in general, if you were an average person in India trying to learn English because English was this great currency which gave you power, right? And this English-speaking elite which controlled the corridors of power was always looking down at you, laughing at you, saying what you do is wrong and it is backward and you need to be helped by us, right? You are going to develop a deep-seated sense of hatred. And I believe that this deep-seated sense of hatred was existed in the mercantile communities. You see, if the poor or the underprivileged had that hatred, it wouldn't have mattered. It was the mercantile communities which had money, but were in the public sphere, in the cultural sphere, were being projected as crooks, villains, as against the people, right? They had this deep sense of anger, and they had a sense of identity crisis. The English speaking secular liberal elite had already developed an identity. That identity was Indian, secular, progressive, modern, liberal. That identity existed. Strangely, from the colonial period, this identity, because it was essentially running the state and professional services, went into the hands of Brahmins and castes. That gradually changed, and that to the English-speaking Brahmin and caste, the even smaller minority than what you see in the non-English-speaking, the what one would call the vernacular Brahmin caste. There's a thing from Biju Mohan who says factual error in saying Congress Party elected Patel. No, they did not elect Patel as Prime Minister. I did not say that. I said that they wanted Patel to be president of the Congress Party before independence in 1946. That was what they had voted for. Patel withdrew from the thing, and Kripalani was made the thing, and Nehru was made the Prime Minister, and that was Gandhi's choice. Right? Patel was not the prime ministerial candidate. So what I'm saying is Patel actually said that I'm not going to be prime minister candidate entirely, as is evident from letters, and we as historians have tried to avoid that through letters written, and Patel reluctantly withdrew from the space thanks to Gandhi's intervention. Okay, so let me come back to the point. So there were these mercantile castes across India who were rich but did not have control of the public sphere, who did not have control of the state. In a sense, the 90s is their revolt. In a sense, it is their search for an identity. And Hindutva, right from the beginning, has been their identity. It came to the forefront. Interestingly, it did not, because for a large period of time, the state, the identities that it propagated through its own institutions were all liberal, secular, progressive. And here I'm talking about the center, right? Obviously, I'm not saying they were leftist. Today, these people, Nehru is called a leftist, but obviously, even till the late 80s, he was never called a leftist, right? The Congress was never called left in those days. So what I'm saying is that in this particular elite actually slowly disappears and makes a compromise post 90s when we see market open up. Once the markets open up, once the markets become dominant, the mercantile castes actually find a stance to become dominant as well. They gradually enter into state policy making. Even then, even during the period of Vajpayee, this was very difficult for them today. They still could not manage to do that, right? It is only in the mid-2000s that we see a significant shift, even in corporate boards. It is interesting that a study done by a JNU researcher shows that I think in 2006-07, there's a increasingly 2 or 3 mercantile castes take over the boards. Remember, the boards are different from ownership. Boards of corporates in India, and these are Banya, Marwari not as a caste, but Banya, and I'm saying caste community, Banya, Jain, and Khatri from the north. The Khatris actually become very, very important and powerful and become a core of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, these people, right? And they are the core of the BJP's rise. They are the core with the rise of the stock markets throughout the 2000s. From the 90s, but throughout the 2000s, it's actually becomes very, very big. At that point, we see that the rise of this particular set of castes who actually didn't have any identity in the public sphere. So they had to reinvent, reimagine homogeneous identities. And they actually found it in certain kinds of cultural artifacts which already existed. One of this was Amar Chitra Katha. Another was calendar art, which emerged from, Kerala actually, right? Calendar art, the European art forms which were indigenized, right, by Raja Ravi Verma. It became the more the kind of the iconography of all religion of gods and goddesses that we see, a lot influenced by that calendar art. And when Ramayana is made as a serial in the 1980s under Rajiv Gandhi, who is advised by Arun Nehru to say, Ramayana, you must start Ramayana because this is a way to catch the Hindu voter, right? Because in 1984, the RSS had entirely switched to Congress. In fact, Nanaji Deshmukh, after the 84 Sikh pogrom, had in his Dashera speech supported Rajiv Gandhi and said that all RSS people should vote for Rajiv Gandhi, which is the reason you see this 410 seats, because that particular part actually went to Rajiv Gandhi at that time, and Arun Nehru's support advice to Rajiv Gandhi was to become more and more Hindu. So those who are from that period would know that Rajiv Gandhi actually did havans and stuff, and it was broadcast live on Doordarshan. And Ramayana was introduced as part of that process. And Ramayana then becomes entirely based on all the costumes, everything that we saw in Amar Chitra Katha or calendar art. And suddenly a uniform identity is being reimagined. It is partly being reimagined through these serials, through calendar art, and through reimagining and reinvention of certain kinds of rituals and certain kinds of festivals. For instance, the festival of Karwa Chauth in the north, where women actually have a fast for their husbands, right? Where did that come from? It actually existed in certain kinds of caste groups in the north, but it became popularized entirely by Karan Johar movies, case serials, and all these things. Suddenly everyone said, oh, this is our tradition. These traditions were being invented. And gradually these traditions actually led to the rise of what would I thought was hidden away in the homes. Now it came out into the public sphere. And that is the beginning of a big change in the composition of the middle class itself. The dominance of the trading and mercantile classes in the public sphere, which takes place especially from the mid-2000s, from about 2008-9, big change that takes place. And we see that gradually the public sphere is moving more and more right. And that was the kind of the base from which Modi emerged. And Modi became supported, got massive support from the media, from the corporate world. And corporate said that this is the person who should be CEO. I mean, Anil Ambani, Sunil Mittal, they actually supported Modi for Prime Minister many years before Modi actually became Prime Minister. So the mercantile classes, politics and culture, which was reinvented and recreated and created these new identities, is what we see today as the emergence of a new Hindutva. It is different from the BJP of the 90s, a very state-oriented Hindutva that is taking place right now, which is, I think, a much bigger danger. I'm going to stop right now because I can see a lot of people want to talk and also would want to, I'm sure there would be more questions here.
I'm Dr. Santosh. I'm actually from Trivandrum Medical College. If you look at the same time in Europe, there has been a lot of parallels and also a lot of contrary things happening in Europe also. You can see that by the end of World War II, the war had taught Europe a lot of lessons, and maybe the war has actually made a lot of difference in building a secular society from the similar sort of right-wing or maybe it's a similar picture there. Look at the India from the British rule, we have not gone through this miserable life of wars which has happened actually in Europe. And this lack of war, what war does is that it engraves so much of ideas, so much long-lasting ideas in any society. But if a society doesn't go through a war, society might not actually help. This just because of one person having an idea of like a more leftist idea, the Congress swayed to the left for a small period of time, and it actually comes back to the right now. And to learn lessons from a war, it's very difficult. So Do you think that there is another way of learning lessons other than a war?
So I think this is a very, very interesting question, and honestly, this is something that I have asked myself as well. In fact, this is it was a dissertation topic that I'd chosen for my PhD, which I never did. Which when I'd gone for my INLAC's interview, this is something that I had thought of doing, which is the impact of the war on the change in politics, and it was actually influenced partly by the fact that for a long time, I had no idea, thanks to the propaganda that we've seen in the West or even in Hollywood movies, that Churchill actually lost the election after World War II. Churchill was defeated; he was thrown out by the people of Great Britain, right? And I didn't know why, and it's over the last few years that I've tried to see why that happened, and we understand. I see that there's a lot of writing that has been done on it. Which is essentially, as you pointed out, the war actually had a huge role in breaking down class distinctions in Great Britain. The not class in the sense of the Marxist sense, but the class in the British sense of the lord, and that the lords are different, the royals are different, those who are sirs are different. That was broken down significantly by the war, by the experience of the trenches, and also that the British state had to promise people that they will be given jobs, they will be given universal education, they will be given health, they will be given a minimum security of life if they went to war, because that was the only way to popularize universal conscription. So this was one of the deals that was made with the British people. And when the war ended, Churchill and all wanted to stop it, and therefore they lost. Attlee won. What happened in India, I would think, is that the masses got radicalized by the national movement. And one would have to look at the fact that a lot of the things that we identify with the Congress party, the Indian National Congress, whether it is non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience, these are all various ways in which local movements, peasant movements, workers' movements, Adivasi movements were incorporated by the Indian National Congress, and they realized that this is the time to fight. This is the time. And whenever it went out of hand, whenever it looked like that it would become much more mass-oriented, people might rise up and question class differences, might question property rights, Gandhi always withdrew. So whether each and every one of these, Gandhi has withdrawn, and we've seen that division between the Congress Socialist Party, which was the left-oriented part of the party, and Gandhi. And Nehru, in fact, was on the socialist side. And we know that has happened, especially, I think, after civil disobedience, especially that happened. I think that the Indian national movement radicalized people from being subjects, from being people who said that whatever the state does, we have to accept. If the state takes something from me, we have to accept it. They became people who were radicalized into believing that they deserve things. They deserve, the government needs to give something. They deserve that the government is for the people. And that was, so it was actually not Nehru being left-wing. Nehru actually utilized the people's radicalization to win. It was Indira Gandhi who used the people's radicalization to win, because we were coming out of a national movement. Globally, there was a sense of the Soviet Union being the right model, and that kind of played a big role in the public domain itself in terms of ideologies, in terms of hegemonic ideologies. And therefore, I would say that these people utilized which was already in there. Today, it's not as if Indira Gandhi came today, it's not as if she would suddenly turn left and win an election. Because turning left doesn't win you elections any longer, right? That's what we're seeing. So, therefore, I'm saying that essentially the division that we see, when you said that, is there a warlike experience makes people radicalizes and makes changes? I think national movement was part of that process. When generations forgot about it, it changed significantly. Yes, we have not had that kind of an upheaval in a war type of upheaval, but we've had various movements, political movements in India, which have radicalized people and at times have also had the opposite effect as well. So I think that it's not always true that war or struggle will lead to a left orientation. Sometimes it can be the exact opposite. After all, the entire Jewish state, Israel, emerged out of great amount of deprivation of the Jews in concentration camps, and they emerged out of it to become very quickly a very right-wing and insular state. So that is, therefore, I'm not sure whether there is a direct correlation between them. But yes, political movements, struggles of various kinds definitely leads to radicalization of the people. That's my sense. But I don't have a definitive view on it. Can I read out Biju Mohan's question? Because he has a mic problem. He's saying that the popular films of Manoj Kumar in 70s, like Purab Paschim, carried right-wing nationalist propaganda. Isn't it IPTA's or IPTA's influence in film industry faded in 90s? I think that the IPTA's influence actually faded before that, before the 80s. By the 70s, the IPTA was kind of sidelined. So we have certain kinds of films that emerged. Purab Paschim, again, I think during the war periods, especially after the China war, especially there were certain jingoist films which came out, but they were not communal. I think that distinction has to be made. That there was jingoism, there was right-wing nationalism, but it was not communal nationalism. So that distinction still existed. I think the communal nationalism actually emerges towards the end of the 80s and early 90s with a movie like Gadar, and a lot of these movies that I'm talking about were not IPTA influenced at all. I mean, these were hardcore pot boilers of people who later on went on very quickly to make different kind of movies as well. So look at Amitabh Bachchan himself. Yes, Amitabh Bachchan, of course, was very keen to do a Satyajit Ray film and couldn't do it, and therefore he's just a voice in Shatranj Ke Khiladi. He wanted to be part of the actually, it is interesting, as you pointed out, one of the popular directors who made absolute potboiler commercial movies like Shahenshah is a gentleman called Tinu Anand, who was Satyajit Ray's assistant director in 7 films. So yes, there was that IPTA influence that existed, and a lot of the directors, filmmakers, actors were closely tied to it. Utpal Dutt, for instance, was I think a member of the CPIM. There was A.K. Hangal, who was also a left-oriented person. There was David, various people. Dina Pathak, they were all people from the left. But the mainstream commercial cinema of the late 70s and 80s was driven by people who had nothing to do with the left, but felt that the left-oriented cinema, what we today would be calling left-oriented cinema, because it is complex. It has all of these things. It has anti-capitalist rhetoric, but it also has nation, great, mother is so great, family is great. So there's a complex hodgepodge of everything. They were downright commercial cinema makers. It's just that society was different. It had a different space. By the 90s, in fact, India Today did a poll in the mid-90s as to who is the hero of IIM. They did a poll amongst IIM students. And who is their idol? Who would they want to be like? And they voted for Harshad Mehta. Harshad Mehta. And I think Harshad Mehta had been jailed right before that, but they still felt that he's a great person. Right? So what I'm saying is that there is a significant change in cultural attitudes very quickly post-fall of the Soviet Union and liberalization here, as a certain kind of culture which was hidden away certainly came into the forefront. Very quickly, I want to add on one thing which I missed out. I think 9/11 played a very important role globally in mainstreaming Islamophobia by saying that making anti-Islamic statements is okay for the upper middle class. 9/11 made that because it became okay in the West. Many leftists, Norman Gerrars, for instance, actually became Islamophobic. They said things against Islam. There were the very hardcore secularists, right? Chris Hutchins. There was, and then the Darwinian guy who's written The Selfish Gene. I'm forgetting his name. these people actually became very, very anti-Islam because it was okay to make these statements. So I think that there are these watershed moments: the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of Thatcherite, Reaganite economics, and then 9/11 made these big changes. And in India specifically, the rise of the stock markets and finance played a huge role in the transition of the elite from, as I said, again, I'm not saying that the elite was progressive. I think that they were not progressive. It was a sham. From what today is called the Lutyens, the English-speaking, Brahmin, caste controlling elite, to a non-English-speaking, semi-vernacular, mercantile groups who have now emerged and are now ruled, and who have what would be called a chip on the shoulder. This Hindutva has a chip on the shoulder.
I was just curious as to how the neo-Hindutva could garner the support of the oppressed classes, and about how they could capture the imagination of these classes of people who have been historically kept out of power, not only from power, but also in organizations, in representations in organizations. You have rightly pointed about the Brahmin caste representation or the upper caste representation in the Congress. But how come these global events, how could these people bring out so much? Because India is basically divided on caste. Indian society basically is divided on caste, and caste is a dominant working mechanism here. How could the neo-Hindutva get around this and get the support of the OBCs and the Dalits? That was my question.
So, this is in the sense the most interesting question that I've been trying to address, because obviously this is a question that all of us are asking. How did that happen? And the most interesting thing, and I just start from the Axis My India poll of 2019, which is very, very accurate, right? And there you see actually the Congress does extremely well amongst rich people. It does extremely well amongst those who have MBA, MBBS. It has equal vote share amongst those with professional degrees. It does very badly amongst the poor. Why does that happen? How is it that the Modi BJP does so well amongst the poorest of the poor? And actually, I have, from 2014, I've been trying to think about it. What has caused the, what would call the fascism of the masses? What caused it? And I would say that here, it's the caste parties which are to blame. And I think if we look at it, it is essentially, if one looks at BSP or the Samajwadi Party, and I think I haven't done much research on the southern parties, the Dravidian parties, but I think that probably happened earlier in Tamil Nadu. Essentially, BSP is a single caste party. It is the party of the Jatavs, right? Which is the dominant Dalit caste in UP, and some estimates say that out of 20 whatever percent Dalits in UP, 20 odd percent, 12 to 13% are just Jatavs. There's another very big Dalit community caste group called the Valmikis. Mayawati has never let Valmikis gain any space within the BSP. The same is true for the Yadav-dominated parties. All other OBC groups have found it very difficult to break through. The reason why, let's say, someone like Nitish Kumar broke away from the Janata Dal or the Rashtriya Janata Dal was because Kurmis found it very difficult with just 4% representation and spread thinly across Bihar in the RJD. So I think that the dominant caste groups, and here amongst OBCs and Dalits in various states, have managed to control these caste parties, which from the 90s appeared to be progressive. They appeared to be parties which are progressive, and they will actually lead to weakening of the caste system. They will lead, but that did not happen. Now, I believe that two things happened because of this. One of the things that the Modi Shah machinery has done brilliantly, and which others did not manage to do before that. And in a sense that this is actually was always projected by, Govindacharya and others, and even I would think Gurumurthy and others, what they called social engineering was alliance between the upper caste, the mercantile caste, the vernacular elites, and the deprived lower caste. So they believed that, and I think the Modi Shah machinery believes that as well, that there are these caste groups which are dominant. Then they are the people who have got the maximum benefit of reservation. They have their people in especially in UP and Bihar, they have their people in police stations, in various kinds of government offices. They can get work done. They have their representation amongst IAS officers. Very little, but still they have. They are the people who've captured it. The Modi Shah machinery has managed to enter the non-dominant Dalits, the non-dominant OBCs, who have a problem with the dominant Dalit and dominant OBC. And I think, it was only when I looked at demonetization, I actually very quickly believe that this is an absolute genius idea, political idea. The reason why I believed it is that in India, 30 odd percent of Indians at that time were living on about 13 rupees a day, family, right? Now, have such people ever seen a 500 or 1,000 rupee note? No. They've never been paid the wages with a 500 rupee note. They've always got wages at best at 300 rupees. And when we sent out reporters, I used to run NDTV India at that time, the Hindi channel of NDTV and the business channel NDTV Profit. And when we sent out reporters, I had just this one question to them, that just ask them, have they ever seen a 500 rupee note? Right? The poorest people. And they universally said, no, we haven't. Ha, kabhi dekh. I'm saying this in Hindi. Ha, ek baar dekha. I've seen it once. Right? That is the poorest of the poor. These are the most backward castes. These are the non-dominant Dalits. And demonetization allows Modi to actually create a link with them, where they think this man is for us. He is attacking the rich and he is for us. And it is interesting that Uma Bharti, in a speech in UP in 2017, actually said that Narendra Modi is like Lenin. He is like Karl Marx. So she likened him to Lenin and Karl Marx. Right? And our bureau head there, Kamal Khan, told me, I asked him that what are BJP's prospects? This is in 2017. He said that BJP is not winning because of Hindutva. It is winning because Modi is seen as the Karl Marx. This is a very interesting statement, right? So another reporter told me that when you talk to an Yadav, to even a middle class, intermediate caste, they are opposed to Modi because of demonetization and the economy. But the very poorest, he went to a village which was literally inside a forest, and where people lived for about 3 to 4 months. They live in the trees. And this is in the middle of UP. They live in the trees because it floods there, and then they can't come down from the trees. So they have these hammocks in the trees where they live. There's no school, there's no hospital. They all had heard of Modi. And he went and asked them that, who will you vote for? And they said Modi. And he said, why? He said, because he is for the poor. So this particular move that he did, and I believe that Modinomics or Modi's economics is exactly that. He does not care for the middle class because he knows that the middle class will vote for him. They're communal. They love him. They'll vote for him. He does not, he ensures that big business stays alive, does well. He ensures that those who are invested in stock markets do well so that money comes in. But otherwise, all the government money is actually spent using, and this is not documented, but many reporters tell us that there is something called in Hindi, a page is called panna, right? Panna. And the BJP has a system called Panna Pramukh, or the head of a page. This should sound very strange. What is the head of a page? It is the electoral roll. So there is a person who is in charge of one page of the electoral roll, right? And I spoke to an RSS, very senior RSS person, who told me that how does the Shah machinery work? Again, I cannot substantiate this. Maybe this is totally wrong. This is hearsay being told by reporters, people who have written on the BJP, and those who are within that Sangh system. The Shah machinery, they look at an electoral roll and they find out what is the caste composition. So in UP, if the electoral roll says that this person is a Jatav, right? they know there's no chance of that person voting for BJP. So there is no point in giving that person anything. That this person is a Dalit, Jata will always vote for BSP. No point in giving them a gas connection. Take your gas connection to the Parsi. Take your gas connection to the Khatik, right? These small caste groups who we don't hear of, right? Take them and give them the thing. So on paper, it looks like 8 crore gas connections given, right? But who have they been given to? When reporters go and say it's not working, they talk to the person who's closest to the road, which is the dominant Dalit in a Dalit village. The person inside has got it because that person will vote. One of my colleagues who now works is a reporter for the BBC, actually called me up and said that you are right. She had traveled all over UP before 2019. And she said, you're right. I spoke and went to the poorest people, all say Modi is for them and they support Modi. As soon as you go up the ladder in the low backward castes, in the Dalits, but slightly well-to-do, they're all against Modi. They have been affected by the economy. Now look at the numbers here. We have 100 crore people, right? Who are 15 plus, who can work. 100 crore people who can work, who should get jobs. In China, the labor participation rate has come to close to 70%. In India, out of those 100 crore people, 40 crore work, right? About 42 crore look for work. So if you look at it, a majority of working age population in India doesn't even look for work because they don't even think they can get work. They're so poor, they don't even think they can get work. So when we talk about unemployment being a problem, it is a huge problem, right? But for those who have never had any work for generations, and these are many, even the government's own data tells us that about 10% of people have never worked, right? For them, it doesn't matter. Their father didn't work. They never thought they can work. They only live on the discards of society. What a community gives them, they somehow survive on that. So these are the people. It is interesting. One of our reporters, who was a senior reporter, went to a Bihar village in 2015. And he came back and he said that there was one family, right, where they had a small hut, no roof. There was water. When it rained, water would come in, right? And he followed. There were 2 children sitting outside the butcher's shop. So he asked them, "What are you doing here?" And they said that we are going to collect. When the butcher cuts and sells the chicken, he's going to throw away the entrails, and we are going to take that. So they collected that, went back, and he said that they are the Majhis. You know Jitan Ram Majhi, who became the chief minister, right? So he went and asked them that, who will you vote for, this family? Not had work for 2 years, very extremely poor, children don't have anything, they eat rice and they boil this chicken entrails and stuff and eat that. No money to even buy salt. Who will you vote for? They said, we'll vote for Modi. He asked why. He said, because he has given gas connections to people like us. And this is revealing. And they're giving certain things to people like us. And that opens up a door for me to go and ask for more later on. I know I won't get a gas again. So this has opened up a door for me to touch the state, right? Which otherwise was completely beyond me, right? So Modi realizes that actually, if you look at it, even now, in 2017, the NABARD survey tells us that the average household, 30% of Indian households live under 1,250 rupees per head per month, right? And 6,000 rupees to them is a lot of money. So if PM Kisan allows you to get one patta deed and get 6,000 rupees, that's a lot of money. That's enough. State governments will give you something, that's enough. You get free ration for 80 crores and I'm telling you they'll vote for Modi. So that is the I think to a large extent, backward caste and Dalit parties which kept out other castes, other Dalit castes and OBCs, they are responsible for the rise of the Hindutva within the oppressed. The fact that these, And it is interesting that if you look at the Jatavs or those who are active amongst Dalits, they actually question Hinduism. They question dominant Brahminical religion or anything. But the lowest actually are increasingly going back into a Sanskritized mode.
So what do you think led to the total wipeout of leftists in the West Bengal? Because the BJP is coming out in a big way in West Bengal. Your opinion?
I'm saying that I come from a leftist family, and my father's youngest brother, is a member, an active member of the West Bengal CPIM. And I think that one of the biggest reasons is that West Bengal has been an extremely violent state. I don't know whether Kerala is also like that, but West Bengal has been an extremely violent state from the time of the CPIM itself. And it's worth actually admitting that and accepting that there was always a threat of violence in the operation of the government in West Bengal. And when Mamata Banerjee came to power, right, she basically unleashed a campaign of absolute terror. So, and the left not having any control over the central government at that time, having lost, the center was in 2008, Manmohan Singh manages to get rid of the CPIM, right, from the center. CPIM, therefore, has in 2011, when Mamata Banerjee wins, CPIM cadre have no shelter. So they're killed, their houses burned, thrown out of villages, they are forced to move into, camps, they live there. Many of them then start looking for alternatives. And the Congress is not an alternative. In 2014, the Congress loses. Who is the alternative? The alternative is only Modi. So Modi appears as their savior. So if you look at it en masse, the CPIM cadre have shifted to the BJP, not because of any communalism. Again, interesting CSDS survey, which says that BJP voters, 80% of those who voted for BJP in 2019 believe that Muslims are legitimate citizens of India, that the Prime Minister of India should be secular. These are 80% of BJP voters in West Bengal. Who are these people? These are essentially leftists who are scared of Mamata Banerjee's terror. That is the reality. They had no other option but to vote for BJP. If the Congress had been in power, I think they would have voted for Congress. The left cannot put up a shelter for them any longer. So large-scale movement has taken place to the BJP of the left vote. In fact, I wrote several pieces on this in NDTV, and I did a video on this before the elections where I showed how the left vote actually shifted en masse in 2019. And I actually more correctly predicted that the BJP would get at least 20 seats in 2019 in West Bengal precisely for this reason. So the CPIM being wiped out is entirely because Mamata Banerjee's terror tactics forced it to move to the BJP. I think that if BJP loses the elections in 2024, then the BJP will get wiped out in West Bengal. And there's a chance, if the left aligns with the Congress, for it to make a comeback. If the center gets defeated. I think the reason the BJP has done well in West Bengal is entirely because Modi is at the center. And if Modi loses or the BJP loses and the Congress comes, the Congress will do well because there is a groundswell against Mamata Banerjee, which cannot be seen through the election results because the groundswell suddenly appears in West Bengal. Can I read out Shamlal's question because his audio is not clear? We all know the religious caste system is deep-rooted in India. Politicians are widening the existing gaps in this regard for their gains. We know there are some serious problems as a result of it, but are there any solutions? At least some suggestions from somebody who sees things from a national perspective will be a huge bonus. You can say something about what can be done to curtail this Modi Shah jingoism. I wish I had an answer for this question. I wish I had an answer for this question, really. Because, unfortunately, to me, ultimately, it is corporate control of national media. I come from the media, and therefore I have probably an overblown sense of what the media can do. But I think that in today's world where we are all on our computers or phones all the time, our identities have become split. We really have become like today. I don't know. I'm half the time I'm on screen, either doing a video or chatting with someone on a screen, on WhatsApp, tweeting. I don't know what my persona is. Am I this Twitter persona who always is trolling the right wing and abusing right wing people, cracking jokes? Am I the editor who used to anchor? I don't know. Who am I? Am I this person sitting here, or am I that person who I'm seeing in the screen? So I think that we are split within as individuals, as within ourselves, our physical being and our material presence in the digital world. We have become the same. We have become, extensions. Our material presence in the digital world has become seriously a part of our existence, and because of that, media is so important today. I think the only way to defeat jingoism and communalism is if corporate India believes it has to change. Sadly, there is no other way out. Sadly, we are in a situation where corporate control of media is absolute, it is complete. The BJP gets 80% of corporate money, and it is able to use that money and deploy that money to create consensus, which is, the way in which WhatsApp and various things are used to spread fake news and things. That, therefore, to me, is the only way, is if the corporates one day decides this is enough. Otherwise, I'm sorry, I'm sounding pessimistic, but as I said, I wish I could have an answer to that. And if anyone here has an answer, I'm happy to listen.
I have a question. With this background, what do you think is the future of the mainstream left in India?
Mainstream left in India, I think that it's a difficult future, and I think that the future became difficult, except in Kerala, because of its own unique history, where it has certain different space. I think the future became difficult. Everyone knew from 89, 90 when the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Because it became increasingly easy to suppress the left. My father was, as I had said earlier, he was a trade unionist. He was a teacher. He was a university teacher in Delhi University, but he was also the founder. He kind of founded the Delhi University Teachers Association. And he was the campaign manager and planner for the CPIM candidate in 1977 against Devi Lal in Haryana. And one of the things the reason they were able to do that is because there had been a teachers movement and a student movement there. So in that pocket, the left had become popular. Right? But he had to run away. Even though he did very well, the people he was going to be shot. He was going to be killed. Many years later, he met the DGP who said, "Oh, you are so and so. I had the order to shoot you." Right? So it's not easy to be left actually operate. All of you know, because some of you are activists and have operated. I'm not. But to be leftist in the North is very easy it's almost easy to get. It's a short target on your head. If you go and say that, big landlord should be defeated, right? Or corporates are bad, it's a target on your head. You're going to be shot. You'll be killed. And this has become increasingly easy because of massive inequality in India and 30 years of anti-communist, anti-socialist propaganda. So even the poor believe that socialists are bad, right? So it is a difficult process, but I think that if we see a significant amount of slowdown, I think one of the things that has happened for the middle class, the upper middle class is seeing a massive decline in their living standards. And therefore, now people have started questioning capitalism. Even upper middle class people have started questioning capitalism. They're also started to say things like, maybe socialism is good. Who knows? Maybe capitalism is bad because the person who was earning 2 crores a year is suddenly without a job, right? That is happening across the board, right? So maybe that will give a space for parts of the elite to take another look at mainstream media, left, and support it, be more vocal about it. That is the hope one can have.
When we saw this lockdown coming up about this time last year, and there were so many people walking from Delhi back to rural India, and you could actually tell the caste of these people. These are most probably Dalit or Muslims who are walking back from cities, who probably had so fragile jobs that they couldn't survive there in a lockdown. So I have this intriguing thought, because I think I should introduce my point. I'm not a leftist. Even though I was in SFI and all, but that's because of peer pressure. I'm not a leftist, but I still think. How do you think something as generalized as a lockdown affects a group of people who you can just look by their dress, by how they look, and they just fall down, dying on their roads, and we know who these people are. And
yes,
how do we historically look at Muslims and the caste system in India, and just not see that caste in India is, or class in India is basically caste? So I would like to invite your thoughts on this.
So let me start with a slight contrary view on the lockdown and people leaving. I think that the reason people left was, and again, this is going to be a provocative statement to make, but I actually tried to cross-check it with many reporters who then tended to agree with me on certain issues and did not agree with me. I think people left because they were promised money in their villages, because the government was giving money and food to people in villages, right? And I know, for instance, a carpenter who does work in my house every now and then. And right at the beginning of the lockdown, he said that I have no money. What should I do? So I transferred 10,000 rupees into his account. And then I heard that he has gone back to the village. So I asked him that what happened. Wasn't that enough, 10,000 rupees? Because he went in 2-3 days. So he said, no, our Sarpanch, which is the head of our panchayat, called me and said that money is going to be given. Come quickly. Right? So a lot of people, when they were asked, I have my ex-colleague and friend who is a very famous Hindi and news anchor. I'm probably not well known in Kerala, but in the north, he's very well known, called Ravish Kumar. I asked Ravish that, can you find out for me whether a lot of people are leaving because of this, that they are being promised? So he said, okay, give me 2 days, I'll find out. So he found out and he said, you're absolutely right. A lot of people are walking back because they're going to miss out on that money which is being distributed. They are going to miss out on the fact that 500 rupees is being put into an Aadhaar linked account. They're going to miss out on the free ration that's being given. They want to go and take that, and people from the villages are calling them up and telling them to come. So the initial days of the lockdown was actually good for the poor. This is a strange thing I'm saying. In fact, immediately in May, June, the number of Manrega days reached their record level, right? Because the government provided Manrega work to these people. After that, things started collapsing. But coming now to your point about how easily we look at these people and can make out, you're absolutely right. Now, I would have to say that my own idea about caste has changed significantly in the last 20 years. Because caste actually is both a hierarchy, but also a community. So it is very important for a lot of people, especially in villages, they survive on caste. Poor people survive on caste because caste is actually an extension of a kinship system. So if we look at caste both as a hierarchy and as a lateral thing as well, then they have two very different roles. So, a person who's a Paswan, as in Ramvilas Paswan's community, a Dalit, a poor person can go to Ramvilas, could have gone to Ramvilas Paswan and said, you're doing nothing for me. I am from your caste, right? And Ramvilas would do it because he would get the caste as an identity is a very strong and at the level of a jati, strangely egalitarian. People belonging to a same caste actually have a certain degree of equality despite monetary differences. But in terms of hierarchy, it is very clear. As you said, you can look at them and you know that they're Dalits. You look at them and probably Muslims. It is very, looked at the CMI data from 2019, if you look at the decline in employment, the biggest decline in employment has been amongst Muslims. And again, we have no clear data. Unfortunately, I've asked the CMI, Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. They do these CPHS surveys. I've asked them whether they can provide me this data. I don't have the money to do it. So if they give it to me for free, which they very kindly often give, then I'll get it. One of the things that I want to see is that, you see, Muslims in India, I'm coming to Muslims specifically, have never got government jobs. They've been always kept out of government jobs, right? Even corporate jobs do not take Muslims. Like, let's say, the mercantile caste-dominated corporate jobs will keep Muslims out. So the proportion of Muslims amongst self-employed is very high relative to their population. This one can see even in the various committee reports, right, which come out. So they are self-employed. What do? They are tailors. They work in garment factories. They are across India. They work as car mechanics, right? In a lot of North India, car mechanics, running small, and car mechanics and running small mechanic shops is across India one of the biggest employers. You'll be surprised to know that. Even the government's data tells us it is one of the biggest employers, right? With the spread of cars in India and utility vehicles and two-wheelers. So Muslims occupy that, which is why in Hindi, the right wing calls them puncture wala, people who fix punctures. I used to think, where has that come from? It is because they do this work. They have no other options. So what has happened is that one of the reasons why we have increased hatred for Muslims is because of the decline of government jobs. And this will be strange, because if there were government jobs, then the upper caste Hindus would always get it. Right? It is a great thing to have a school teacher's job or a small peon somewhere, or you would be an upper caste in that you've got a job. As government jobs have collapsed in the last 15, 20 years, most Hindus are actually competing in the self-employed space. And there, the competition with Muslims is pretty high. In North India, in Delhi, for instance, Uber and Ola drivers have a very high representation of Muslims. Zomato delivery people, very high representation of Muslims, much higher than their population, right? So this is where suddenly these people are competing, and they're saying that these people are taking away our jobs. The older lot never felt that because Muslims were never competing with them. If you went to become a school teacher, which Muslim was being allowed to become a school teacher or a college teacher? If you were becoming an IS officer, which Muslim was competing against you? If you were going to get a Class B officer's job, who was competing? So you could be secular. Today, suddenly, you need that Ola, Uber, Zomato job, or a job as a tailor or in a garment factory putting clothes together, and you don't want it anymore. You have a problem.
Before independence, there was socialist Congress togetherness, and after independence, that did not happen. And that was a pre-independent scenario, and you had talked very nicely about the present scenario. And I could put a question: do you see any suggestion that the socialist concept getting united as if it is a fight on racism at the present time, so that the future can be saved?
In pre-independence, there was an entity called Congress Socialist Party, which was formed at one point, right? And this Gandhi used very cleverly. There was a lot of anger that why is this being allowed? And Gandhi said that let them speak here rather than allowing them to go out. In fact, you can find that in even Birla writes to others that this is a good thing. Let them speak within the Congress and let them support. And then Nehru became their leader, and gradually Nehru betrayed them as well. The larger point you're making is that today the bigger fight probably is against communalism and fascism, and therefore there has to be a unity of all those who are against fascism as such, right? Am I correct in understanding?
Yeah. At that time, it was British which was the enemy.
Yeah.
Now, British was using racism, fascism very nicely, very intelligently.
Yeah.
And the present scenario, the Congress Socialist Party, that concept, can it survive? Because it is something we don't see that the old Congress are all socialist people now. Yeah. It is something which is new.
Yes.
But can they create some future positiveness? That is my question.
So if you think of Rahul Gandhi's politics, I would say that it is largely a Latin American socialist kind of notion, right? It's the typical Lula kind of ideas that he has, right? His rhetoric is very anti-capitalist. I personally believe that there has to be some alliance with one segment of India's bourgeoisie. The reason I'm saying that is that it is not possible to fight elections in today's world without money. It is no longer a unified thing. I mean, even the Indian National Congress had to raise money, and one of the things that the Marwadis and people would complain to GD Birla that every year you come and take money from us, but why don't we have representation in these people? They abuse us all the time, right? Patel, in fact, said that these are the people who give us money, and I'm not going to let Jawaharlal constantly abuse them, right? So I think that there has to be a middle ground. I used to believe that if the Congress takes a left line, strong left line, it will be able to give a strong counter to the current right. But I think that it has to do a clever mix of a left line, which will get support not from the poorest people, mind you, but from those who are just above the poverty line, the declining middle class. We know that the number of middle class has declined drastically in the COVID period. That is the space where they will need to have some kind of an alliance. And I think that I agree entirely with you. For a long time, I used to say that my enemy is not communalism. My enemy is market capitalism, because I think that is what leads to free market capitalism, which leads to communalism. But I think that time is gone. There has to be some kind of a wider alliance between liberals and left and socialists, and come together on that socialist standpoint. But again, it is going to take some time. I hope the slowdown is going to make more free market walas turn into slightly sympathetic to socialism, because it's still a very bad word in most of the elite in India. That when you say anything against corporates, they try to say, I am all for secularism, but capitalism is the only way out. That has to change for socialism to find some space. I think it might happen because of the slowdown, because of the recession. I think that it is happening, but maybe it's just wishful thinking on my part.
How do you look upon the Kejriwal politics coming up in Delhi?
I don't have a very high opinion of it, to be honest. I had more expectations from it, but I think that it is a very opportunist entity, and it is a certain kind of middle class politics which is almost apolitical. It has no problem in taking a Hindutva line whenever it wants, thinking that will help them win. So in terms of fighting communalism, unfortunately, I would say Arvind Kejriwal and the AAP has completely failed. They use the BJP's rhetoric repeatedly and do a lot of things which promote Hindutva and communalism. I mean, one of the things that came out right before, when the anti-CA protests were happening, there was no statement from Kejriwal or his ministers. The only statement they gave was that if we had the police under us, we would have cleared this place in 5 minutes. So that is not what one expects from anyone who's fighting fascism, right, or authoritarianism. So I am not very enthused by it any longer. I wasn't when it was the India against corruption thing, because I thought that Anna Hazare was always a fascist. That's a separate issue. But in terms of India today, I don't find it very exciting.
What is the fate of leftism in India?
I think that it depends. It will still have to come out of Kerala and West Bengal, right? These are the places where you have a left tradition. It has the strong presence, partly maybe Bihar, but rest of India, I think it exists in universities. Beyond that, people forget it. Once they leave the university, they forget left, unless they continue to be teachers in those universities. Thing is that it is not easy to be left in India in an environment where for 30 years there's been massive pro-market, anti-socialist propaganda across the media, in schools, everywhere. It has happened. Anyone who ask, they say that free market is a good thing, right? And as long as the free market has a human face, it is fine. So that is the big problem that the left faces today, in the absence of a global consensus, which is pro-socialist. If that happens, then we'll see some kind of revival. But I think that the West Bengal left can revive only if the BJP gets defeated at the center. Because then the BJP in West Bengal goes back to the left and the Congress. So that is the thing. But leftism as such, it faces a big problem because people love you till you say that, oh, I'm a Marxist, or I support Marxism, or I support socialism. In Kerala, obviously, your experience must be different, where there's a strong left movement, strong left presence. But in Delhi or rest of India, it is almost a taboo.